as high as 40%. Joining us now to talk more about all of these developments, Douglas Holtz-Eakin. He served as the chief economist for the White House Council of Economic Advisors under President George W. Bush. He's also the president of the American Action Forum. Doug, thank you so much for being here with us. Let's talk first about this back and forth over the tariff deadlines. I think for a lot of people, they think back to the spring and kind of the chaos that surrounded that moment in time. Do you think this is similar?
Well, I think what happened on April 2nd was not so much the timing as the magnitude. People were shocked by the size of the combination of the universal 10% tariff and then the so-called reciprocal tariffs. And we saw the fallout in financial markets and the reaction around the globe. The magnitudes are now familiar to people. In fact, most of these tariffs have been in place for quite some time now. The average effective tariff rate was 15%. These new announcements raise it to 17%. So the world is adapting to the existence of the tariffs, and I think you get less of the big shock, and now it's more the slow and deepening impact of having these tariffs embedded in the U.S. supply chains and consumers' decisions.
We got this announcement from the president today about a 50% tariff on copper. What do you think about that?
Well, the president has a whole series of tariffs, which he thinks of as sectoral tariffs. These are the aluminum, the steel, this would be copper, autos, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, foreign films is on that list. All of those have been invoked in the interest of national security. And so first you have to decide, well, is there really a national security risk that surrounds copper that merits a 50% cost increase for imports? And then there's a second question, which is, will the tariff alleviate that risk in any way? Will it produce more domestic production of copper, or will we simply just be paying more for copper? And I think there's a real question in some of these cases about whether the tariffs will do anything to change the underlying production in the U.S. and need for the materials in the United States, and thus alleviate the national security risk at all. And so all we've done then is make things more expensive for domestic producers, and we've certainly seen that with the steel and aluminum tariffs so far.
I also want to ask you about something Trump said at this cabinet meeting. He again called for the Fed Chair Jerome Powell to resign. Kevin Warsh, who's been floated as a potential pick for Powell's replacement, and a former Fed governor, said on Fox Business yesterday, in his words, he said tariffs are not inflationary and that he has sympathy for Trump's frustration over the Fed's policy here. What do you think of Warsh's comments there, both that tariffs are not inflationary and his frustration over the Fed policy as it stands right now?
Well, certainly on the merits, I mean, no one thinks of tariffs as inflationary in the sense that they will push prices ever further higher. But there's no question tariffs raise costs, and costs get passed along in the form of higher prices. These tariffs will cause prices to rise for some period. Fed Chair Jerome Powell has emphasized again and again, the whole goal is to have that be a temporary phenomenon and not let it get embedded into the system. And so I think everyone's agreeing that they don't want to have a long-run inflation problem, but you will have something you have to deal with in the short run. The discussion about whether the Fed's policy is correct or not, reasonable people can disagree. You put tariffs into this system, you have two pressures. One is higher prices. The Fed would typically raise rates or hold rates to fight that. And the other is slower growth in employment, and the Fed would usually cut rates to mediate that. Well, now you have to decide which direction you're going to go at first, and people can disagree about that. So I don't think that's shocking. I think the bigger problem is the president openly auditioning people who are only going to come down one direction on that and have lower rates, because he's been pushing the Fed for that for quite some time.
Yeah, and I do want to ask you about that because, as you mentioned, the president has been saying for some time that the Fed should be lowering interest rates. Yeah. A couple of current Fed officials have said a cut could come as soon as July. What do you think about that as a potential move?
Well, I think you can make that case on the merits. For example, we got last Friday's employment report, and everyone said, oh, great report, 140,000 jobs. Well, not really. 70,000 that were state and local governments. Within the private sector, only education and health hired. Hiring's at a standstill out there. There are a lot of people who say, okay, we need to cut to offset that. The opposition would be, well, if you do that, you're giving up on inflation, and inflation's not back to the 2% target. We, the Fed, promised to get it back to the 2% target. And so there's going to be a vigorous discussion at the Fed about what should be done. They've had this discussion for months. They've elected in each case to do nothing, stay where they are. We'll see what happens in the July meeting.
All right, Douglas Holtz-Eakin, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.